Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we look at your word. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. We're looking at 1 Corinthians written by Paul to a cosmopolitan place. Boom. Don't need to go any further. That's the background. Now, when you look at the letter, what is the big problem, or what seems to be the problem that's facing the Corinthians right from the get-go?
So much diversity.
Okay, you got diversity, but in particular you've got divisions. Yeah, diversity, but it's resulting in divisions, and the divisions seem to be focused on
who preached to whom.
Who preached to
Who preached to last, maybe.
Right, and you think about a lot of what we kind of do in our culture. The one that they like. The Apollos appeal
the
to
one that fits their viewpoint.
Exactly, Apollos appeal to those who like
Culture.
intellectual discussions and eloquent language. He talks about Peter, Cephas. Now, Cephas would probably appeal to
Jews,
Jewish Christians, or Christians that like law. Tell me what to do. Tell me the 4 things I got to do. Those would be the ones that would appeal to whom Peter would appeal. Paul, people who wanted truth, sincere people who wanted to believe what was right. At least for Paul. But that was the different, but he didn't use eloquent language. So the people that aren't impressed by language. So we've got these divisions, and it's not unlike what we see now, that we kind of say is a good thing. Paul's saying it's not necessarily a good thing. This isn't necessarily a great thing going on. Okay, so we got a church that's facing some divisions over presentation, over person. And Paul's saying your big problem with this is it's distracting you. And what is it distracting them from? What is so important?
Jesus Christ.
Truth of Jesus
Okay,
Christ.
the truth, Jesus Christ. And in particular, what about Jesus Christ?
What Paul has to say about it.
What Paul has to say, and
His crucifixion.
his crucifixion. It's going to be crucifixion, because that's where Paul, boom, is really big on the crucifixion of Christ. And so it's distracting you from the crucifixion. And he sort of focuses on Apollos, because evidently that's the big division, and his eloquent language. That this is distracting you. When he came to present the cross, why does that seem to run counter intellectual arguments and eloquent presentations?
Because people can't believe that it's a made-up story.
Okay.
Why would God be crucified if He's really God?
It's stupid. It is a dumb thing for people who like intellectual arguments. This is not something you would argue about. It's something you kind of dismiss right away. This is not impressive. And it's not done. You don't have to grasp complex language to get it. It's pretty basic. Now, the danger of what he's saying then is that, these other guys are bad, right? And that you should, but Paul doesn't want to go there. What does he do instead of going and saying, well, Apollos was bad, those who represented Peter were bad, those who said they represented Jesus, they're bad, he doesn't want to do that. What does he do instead?
He puts how do I want to say it? He uses simple language to try to bring them together rather than separate.
Okay, so he wants to...
he wants to bring the good parts
Okay.
together.
Okay, so there are good things that Apollos is doing. And what for Paul is the good thing Apollos is doing?
Watering.
Remember he uses 3 analogies. He uses one in agriculture, he uses one in building, he uses one in service. That we all had jobs to do. And who gave the jobs? God gave the jobs. We all had jobs to do based on what we did well. And his job, using the agricultural image, was to do what?
Plant.
Plant. Paul's job was to plant. Using the construction image, his job was to
Lay the foundation.
lay the foundation. That was his job. Agricultural image, what was Apollos' job?
Water.
He was to water, to cultivate. So Paul was the planter, he was the cultivator, the waterer. With the building image,
He was the constructor.
He was the one that constructed the walls and the roof and all. Okay, so what he's suggesting is that each of them had a role, but who is really in charge of the project? Who?
God.
God causes the growth, and who is the general contractor?
God.
God is. God is the one that coordinates all of this. And ultimately, for the construction, what does God do? Because this is kind of a big deal for Paul.
Each of the individuals in the church are to be building blocks for God's purposes.
Okay, but what is God going to do? What does Paul say God does once the building is constructed? Remember, he's the one that judges it.
Yeah.
Everything is going to be tested with fire. And if the walls are solid, you can feel good. If the walls burn up, then you can feel bad.
He's the inspector.
He's the inspector, right. So we've got all of this going on. So this division is ridiculous because it distracts you from the truth. It also distracts you from the fact that we all have individual jobs to do. And that's going to be a theme Paul's going to pick up in chapter 12, 13, 14. A little bit later, people doing individual jobs. Okay, so he's laid out this sort of the theology. We need to focus on the cross. We need to look past the divisions. We got to recognize that all of God's servants, and that's that third image, are doing what God has called them to do. And they're doing it with a certain amount of diligence. Now he's going to start getting to specific issues. And some of the specific issues are kind of would be unique to the Corinthian church. As we look at it, though, remember, Paul isn't writing this to the Galatians. He's not writing this to the Ephesians or to the Philippians. He is writing this to the Corinthians to address Corinthian issues, not to address Galatian issues or all issues. So that when we interpret it, we want to kind of get into the mindset of what's going on in the Corinthian church so that we can understand what he's doing as he applies, the truth he believes to their situations. Because that's what we want to do. Less look at the situation and more look at how Paul addresses it. And then take that and apply it to the unique situations we face. Because we don't face a lot of the stuff. The Corinthians, the exact stuff they face, we face things that are similar where we can make an application. For example, right at the beginning, chapter 5, we've got a problem in the Corinthian church. And it may be even bigger than you think when you read it. What's the problem? For one, how does it begin? How does that chapter begin? It's actually what?
Reported.
It's been reported, which means what?
It's known, it's well known.
It is well known. Paul knows it. He knows it from them. And what's been reported?
Sexual immorality.
Sexual immorality.
Even the pagans.
Oh, yeah. Where is it occurring? Because, we're talking about Corinth. Throw a dart. You're going to hit sexual immorality. Because we're in Corinth, for crying out loud. There's immorality everywhere, but this immorality is really a problem. Because where is this sexual immorality?
In the church.
In the church. In the community. So it's in the community, and like Ken, you said, it is so bad, it is worse than you find among pagans. It is worse than what you find out there. And what is the specific issue?
Should have his father's wife.
A guy is living with his father's wife. In other words, he is living either with
His mother or stepmother.
his mother or his stepmother. It is not a good situation. Dad is gone. He is living probably with his stepmother. And when they talk about living, he is not living in the basement.
Living in the attic.
He is not living in the attic.
In the annex?
He is not living in the attic. We could go, it's not in the backyard. He's not in a camper. He is living in all sense of the word. With his
father's wife.
Yes. Now, Paul, this is the issue. Paul's response is kind of kind of interesting. What is his response? What's the first thing he says?
You're arrogant.
You're arrogant. Now, you would think he would say, because he's talking about immorality in the church, this guy, and we may look at it and say, well, living with, a stepmother is weird, but not, the worst thing that could happen. Maybe not, maybe it is. But I said that, and maybe it is pretty bad. But he doesn't say, you filthy pigs. He uses arrogant. We want to file that away. We won't talk about it right now, but file that away because they're doing something he considers to be arrogant. And I think this becomes the basis not only for chapter 5, but also for chapter 6.
Okay, maybe there's a point to this later, but historically, we're not even close to anything being historically correct, are we?
Well, evidently, I think we are, based on what he says a little bit later, and I'm going to highlight that because that's where we've missed. In fact, I think we're talking about something that is really specific, maybe to this community, maybe to Corinth, but specific to them. That we have to. That's a good example of how we've got to get into what's happening in Corinth, because I think something more is happening here than we assume.
Okay, but how does this reflect back to what the first 4 chapters said? This was all of a sudden thrown in there out of the blue.
Well, remember,
And
yes, one of the things we see with Paul is we see, and in the letters that are clear and undisputed, and some letters are disputed, whether Paul actually wrote them or whether a follower of Paul wrote them and used his name, which wasn't considered plagiarism 2,000 years ago. It was considered complimentary. If Paul were living now, this is what he would say. And so they had no trouble using his name. That's something we worry about now, but they didn't then. In the letters that are beyond dispute, that they came from Paul's hand because there's similarities between about 5 of these letters. You see a common structure. And what Paul tends to do is he tends to deal with theology, and then he deals with ethic. And you can almost put your finger when he shifts. When we studied Romans, and we went from chapter 11 to chapter 12, and chapter 12 starts with the word therefore, which is beautiful. He moves from the theology to the
Application.
Therefore. This is how you apply it. This is how it should impact your daily living. What's happened in the Corinthian church, but he didn't know the Romans. He had no contact. What's happened in the Corinthian church when he makes this shift, he starts addressing ethical issues that are distinct to them. And so when we move from chapter 4 to chapter 5, we have shifted from the theology, Paul's theology about unity and about cross and about
so is this the thing that's keeping them separated?
yes, in a sense. He's going to go back. Remember, he says arrogance. This is going to be part of what he sees involved in these divisions.
Is it arrogance then, or is it living with your stepmother?
Hold on. I think Paul's biggest concern is the arrogance. Okay. I think that's where because the arrogance is, and we're going to see that in just a little bit, why God considers their actions arrogant.
So is he using this as an example because throughout history, when you say fornication, everybody's head perks up?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think this is a big issue. And I'll tell you, like I said, in a little bit, we're going to see that if this were happening now,
I can give you an example.
Yes, go. Okay, good. Because I don't want the.
Yeah, well, there was a situation where a deacon in the church, a very conservative church, was a pedophile. And it was known by the church body to the point that they assigned an elder to follow him around during church time so that he was not molesting any girl that came to the church. Now, to my way of thinking, and he did a lot of damage, But to my way of thinking, the reaction of the church was arrogance.
Okay, and we're gonna, that's exactly
And-
right.
and-
And we're gonna get,
And that's sort of like what happened yesterday with the Attorney General in New York. He was sort of arrogant about
Okay.
his affairs, even though he wasn't
Okay.
married.
okay,
He was,
this,
and anybody in that position has that arrogance to think they're above.
The law.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, this is gonna be the church, and I'm glad you mentioned law, because the law is gonna be really important here. Okay, so we've got this situation, and he calls them arrogant. What else does he say after he calls them, boy, you guys are arrogant?
Well, they sort of let it go. They sort of admired it, the guy's actions.
They're tolerating it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like following around, like I heard of another church that minister was caught in a compromising situation, and they gave him a leave of absence so that he could spiritually right himself. In the Presbyterian church used to be, you would get, if something like that happened, and it happens in all, you were encouraged to move to another church. And we see that in the Roman Catholic Church a lot. You know, a priest gets in trouble and you transfer him to another place. You know, you recognize that the problem exists, but you just move him on. And what they're doing is a little worse, because they're just keeping him, but it's similar. You know, they are tolerating this action. And this action, I guess what I'm saying, and I think the pedophilia is a good comparison, because this action in this particular community was just as bad as pedophilia would be in ours. And we know that by what Paul's going to say in just a little bit. Okay, so he is, now why might they justify kind of tolerating this?
They have no other options.
Okay, they may be hoping he changes.
Yeah, and they can say.
Okay, that they could save him, so we're going to take our time. You know, with that deacon, we don't need to push it right now. Okay, that could be a possibility. What else?
I was gonna say, at that time, there's no other options. You know, they can't push him somewhere else because there's no place else.
Well, okay, so their options are limited. They either got to push him out
Right.
or keep him in.
But if you
Right.
throw him out, then the world's gonna know.
Then the world's going to know, you know, and the church is painful. This could be a leader in the church. You throw him out, that's going to be a
Yeah,
problem.
but, you know, now all that's true. But if that community, the community of the church,
Mm-hmm.
the community of the Corinth and so forth, if they're basically accepting it,
Yeah.
they may look a little bit the other way, but with a grin, you know.
Right.
That wouldn't mean a thing to them if they put him out and other people knew it. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like, you know,
I see
today,
what you mean.
the
It may be they
the
were,
cell phones, the
Right, right.
TV and all that. It's in that local community, and
Mm-hmm.
evidently, they must all know pretty much about it, because they're the ones that reported it to
Yeah,
Paul.
but the community that's not in the church
Well, let's think.
might look at it differently.
Let's think, because he says this is arrogant on their part. You know, what is going on here?
they're
that would
doing
cause
stuff
him?
like that too.
Yeah, what is arrogant
sure.
here? What is arrogant here?
We're above the law.
Yes,
We're God.
I
We're
think
above
that
the
is,
law of
I think
God.
that is exactly what's going on. I think that, and that comes back to the divisions, because we're talking about authority. And, you know, they're claiming an authority, right? We have the authority to tolerate it. Whether they are articulating it or not, that's exactly what they're doing. They're claiming the authority, and that's kind of tied to this breaking into groups. Well, I listen to Paul. Well, I listen to Apollos. Well, I listen to... So we've got this mishmash of authority, and that's the result. They're claiming an authority that they don't have. Now, what's interesting is, and Paul comes back and he's going to deal with it in the 6th chapter, the people who are accepting this guy may be the people who are following Paul. Why might the people who are following Paul,
Because
certainly not the ones following Peter, the people following Paul, why might they be the one that are kind of tolerating this, which really makes Paul mad.
Because he can't judge.
And what does Paul teach about grace? Oh,
Grace is sufficient.
Grace is
All
sufficient.
sin is washed away by the cross.
And what is Christians, what is our relationship to the law now?
We're not under the law.
We are not under the law. We have been set free from the law. And so you may have some Christians in the Corinthian church saying, we're set free from the law.
We can do what we want.
We can pretty much do what we want.
Yeah.
We can pretty much do what we want. Now, if it is, and Paul's going to go to a lot of pains in the 6th chapter to deal with this very issue, I think it may be the followers of Paul that are the ones, not even of Apollos, but of Paul, that are the ones that are encouraging, well, we tolerate this guy, because he's free
God's
from the law.
grace is sufficient.
God's grace is sufficient. We're free from the law. Okay, so anyway, but I think it does go back. I think it is related to this division, this division of authority. These divisions are putting who really has authority and what the authority is opening that up. Okay, now why? What does he say about himself? And they're doing this. What does he say about his presence in that place?
He's there with he's there in spirit.
He's there in spirit. Now remember, we talked a little while ago. That's why I think it's the followers of Paul that are doing it. That there's question about whether Paul is coming back or not. And he assures them that his intention, remember we saw that last week, is to come back to the Corinthian church. Well, some of the Paul people are saying, this is what he taught, and he's not coming back. So we're just going to apply it on our own. Paul is saying, wait a minute. I may not be here physically,
But I'm here spiritually.
but I'm here spiritually. And when he says spiritually, I don't think he means metaphysically. How is he there spiritually?
He's teaching.
His teaching is there.
Yeah.
Man, they know what he taught, and he didn't teach anything like this,
Yeah.
right? Now, the reason I think it's more serious than it may appear on the surface to us, and why the connection to pedophilia is a good, I think, comparison. When you look at verse 5, what does he want the church to do?
Hand him over.
Hand him over to Satan.
Okay, for what?
Destruction of
For
the
the
flesh.
destruction of the flesh. Now, that's really powerful. Now, think about without using it as a metaphor. What do you think destruction of the flesh sounds like? Burning him up. Destruction of the flesh means he's going to be burned up spiritually, emotionally,
He wants to save his spirit.
physically. I think what he's done, what's happening here, is a violation of the law. That's why he says pagans don't even do it. It is a violation of civic law in Corinth. What else is going on here? Don't know. Whether it involves money or property or, playing fast and loose with other relatives, don't know. But what he's doing is not only against the law, but the punishment for what he's doing is what?
Severe. Yeah.
Death.
Is death. That's why turn him over, because if you turn him into the police, what are they going to do to him? They're going to kill him. Because they're going to execute him because he has done something that in the eyes of the state is illegal and worthy of punishment. So he's telling the Corinthians to do what with this guy? To hand him over. Now, the motivation, though, isn't just hand him over because he's a bad dude.
They wanted to repent.
Yeah, hand him over because that's the only way that his spirit's going to be saved. That's the only way that the body may go, but that's the only way that he's going to change.
Yeah.
Okay? But the bottom line is, you got to turn this guy over. You got to get him out of this
It
community.
seems a little drastic.
Seems a little, but understand, that's why I think pedophilia is a good example.
Yeah, but it's, compared to what we learned in Romans about Paul, it seems a lot drastic for him to be saying that.
Well, why would he do that? Why, if this crime in this society is so heinous, and the Romans didn't execute everybody, is so heinous and that execution is the sentence. Why would Paul say, man, you got to deal with this?
Because other people are gonna think it's okay, he got away with it, so I'm gonna do it too.
Okay, other people,
Remove those.
okay, good, thanks. Other people are going to get away with it, and if we don't
Or it's
deal
going
with
to
it,
bring the authorities down on the church,
it's going to bring if the authorities know that they are
harboring a criminal.
harboring
Yes.
a criminal,
Yes.
it's like if the church is money laundering or doing something that is horribly illegal. Well, when I was in Indianapolis, one of the things, there was an issue that came up about mission trips. And a man, and he was a good man, and whom I respected a great deal. His daughter was going on a mission trip of her own, wasn't going through an organization. She was just going on her own. And he went to the church for support. And I think the church decided to give him a little support. And then he came to the session. So we were fine with that. Then he came to the session and said, how about if I give money to the church and the church give it to her for the mission trip?
Yes,
Why does that become good for him?
because he gets a tax
It's a
deduction.
tax deduction. Could he take it as a tax deduction?
If he gave it to her, no.
No, not if he gave it to her. Not affiliated with an organization, And so he wanted to use the church as
A money laundering.
for money laundering and tax evasion. The session, and it wasn't. It was a discussion. It wasn't something that session said, well, of course not. It was a discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Would we allow him to do that? And if we did, what would the ramifications be right now and for the future? And the church decided, we can't do this. We can't do this because it's against the law.
Yeah. Did you hear what they did at Cole Presbyterian?
Yeah. We want to come because we're going to start funneling our rent through the church, and we give money to the church for rent and they just write a check back to us.
That's much like our president funneled money through
Well,
lawyers.
but this was it's something illegal using the church to do it.
I know.
Okay, we'll come back to that later, John. We'll come back to that later.
Since,
All right.
since our good
All right.
friend Ruby mentioned it the other night.
Oh, we'll come back to it later. All right, so it's a big issue that we got to deal with. Now, but he's really not going to spend a huge amount of time focusing on this issue itself. What seems to bother Paul more than this guy living with his stepmother?
Their arrogance and
Their
their
arrogance.
boasting.
Their arrogance and their boasting. Okay, because he says your boasting is not a good thing. Now, about what are they boasting? Based on what we've already said, what would be the basis of the boasting?
That they don't need to follow the law.
They don't need to follow the law. That they have the authority over
God.
God, over Paul, over the church, that they have the authority. Now understand, they may not be celebrating. This may not be, but Paul is saying, look, what you're doing is arrogant, and by being satisfied with it, that is boasting.
Yeah.
That is boasting. Okay? And why is this boasting going to be dangerous?
A little leaven destroys the
A
whole lump.
little leaven destroys the whole
Batch.
loaf. If you allow
Him to do it.
this to happen, it's not what might occur, what's going to occur.
Bad apple spoils the barrel.
Yeah, it's gonna, if this is your attitude about authority, and you say, well, in the name of God, we've decided to deal with this by having a person follow this deacon to make sure that this won't happen in the future. This is
At
just
church.
Yeah, at church. This is just one example.
else.
But even if you say we're going to take it even further, we're going to follow him. But this is just one example. We're not going to do it again. This is because of a unique situation. What is Paul saying?
No.
Well,
You're
what-
just inviting more of the same
Once it
behaviors.
affects, that's it.
Yeah, and it's the attitude that you've got. Because you're going to look at the next one and say,
Well, he's not as
Well,
bad
not
as
as
this
bad.
guy.
my parents were really involved in a conservative church in Norfolk. In fact, it was so conservative, they considered Baptists to be on the liberal fringe of Christianity. They were on the liberal edge of Christianity. Presbyterians were lost. I mean, that was easy. Methodists were lost, and the Catholics, geez Louise, they were working. They were getting a paycheck from Satan. So, I mean, it was easy for them. But a very conservative church. And my sister was married in that church, was divorced, and wanted to get remarried, and went to the church for remarriage, and absolutely no, I'm wrong, because that was later. This was it. She went to the church to get married to this guy, that she met, which maybe the church was right, because he was kind of a goof. But he was an idiot. What?
Does she listen?
Does who listen?
Your sister.
Well, she knows he was a goof. I mean, he was a.
30
30
Is this the same
30 years
sister
later.
that's in the dictionary next to dysfunctional?
Why is it that the goof ends up being the father of the most wonderful grandchildren in the world?
Oh yeah, well, that's that. Look, I don't even want to go there. But when she went to get married,
He said no.
they said no, and
knew better.
And they said no because he'd been married before. That's what it was. I knew divorce was involved. He'd been married before, and she hadn't. She wanted to get married, and they said no. He'd been married before, and turned him down. But they didn't turn down somebody else who had been married before. But that was a different situation. They both repented and they had both grown, and that made it really easy because she was the daughter of one of the associate ministers. And so it was all worked out well, and the church married him. And my father never got over it, left the church. Because, and that's that idea of authority, that we have authority. We're the ones calling these shots. That's where it gets dangerous, because you start making exceptions and you stop listening to God. So it is an arrogant thing. A little bit of leaven kind of changes the loaf. Now, what does he challenge them to do then? What does he challenge them to do?
Cleanse it out.
You got to get rid of it. If you got leaven, if leaven's going to influence the whole dough, you got to get rid of the leaven, right? And then what you end up with is, and what is leaven?
Yeast.
Yeah, well, it's dough. It's when you make bread with yeast, leaven is a piece of that dough that you kind of put in a damp, wet, nasty place, and it continues to grow, and then you shove it into another bunch of dough. And that little leaven, the yeast spreads and makes the loaf rise. But if you get rid of the leaven, which is kind of nasty when you think about it anyway, what do you end up with?
Flatbread.
You end up with flatbread. But what do you call flatbread?
Matzah.
You call it unleavened bread. And is unleavened bread good? Does that have religious connotations, Brother Manley? Yes, sirree. Because unleavened bread is tied up with Judaism, and in particular Passover. So when you start talking about this, you got to get rid of the leaven, and you may think it's a horrible thing, but what you end up with is unleavened bread. And that is the good stuff. And in case they don't get it, he says, why is that good? For our paschal lamb, Jesus Christ was sacrificed. So he calls in this Exodus imagery. The lamb was sacrificed. Okay? Now, to what does he compare this old leaven?
Malice and evil.
Malice and evil. Now, we really know what it is. It's their claim for authority, right? That we have authority over. We can make the decision. Sounds a lot like Adam and Eve, what happened in the garden. We have the authority to make the decisions for ourselves. Paul says that attitude is really malicious and evil. That attitude. And to what does he compare it? This wonderful unleavened bread.
Sincerity and truth.
Sincerity and truth. Okay? And so, now, he's dealt with this issue, but there's a lot of loose ends, particularly if it's some of Paul's people that are saying this is okay. I'll guarantee you, the people who followed Cephas, man, they're on this like white on rice, because they were condemning everything. Certainly they would have come down on this. But so these are the people that are the liberals in the church that are open to a lot of different things based on what Paul teaches. So Paul's walking a fine line here. If he retreats on what he teaches and says, well, grace does need a lot of rules, or you're not totally free from the law, you're free from most of them. All of a sudden, his theology, what? Is gone. His theology disappears. His whole faith disappears. And for him, Christianity disappears because you don't have anything anymore. So Paul is walking, you're right, John, right here, Paul is walking a real fine line. But Paul is also a pragmatist. He recognizes if this stuff is allowed to continue, this complete Corinthian kind of freedom, the church is going to become
Pagan.
It's going to become a mess. It's going to become worse than the pagans, because at least the pagans are taking seriously civil law, and you're not even doing that. Sort of. You use civil law when you want to. Okay, so we've got Paul addressing that. Now, what does he return in 9? Because he's kind of drifted from the issue, right? And talked about the authority, their claim for authority. What does he return to in verse 9?
Stay away from those.
Now he's back to the sexual morality. So now he's talked about the attitude of the church. Now he's back to the people involved, right? And again, it seems as though there's been another letter. This is not 1 Corinthians. There would seem to have been another letter.
Prologue.
Before this. Yeah, before this. Okay. Now, what might they, and again, Paul, he ties up loose ends. Based on what he has said about, you got to get this guy out, he's leaven, it's malice, it's evil, we get him out, we go back to this purity. Now, what might the Corinthians assume? What might you assume if I say we need to get evil out of the church? We need to live pure lives. That's what we need to do. I'm going to start the Rudiger cult, and we are all going to live lives of absolute and complete purity.
I would say it's impossible.
Okay, but what if you bought into that? If I'm saying that, I might be concerned.
You'd be separatists.
Okay, I'm going to be. We can somehow separate ourselves from sin. If
I know the other guys are all like that, but I'm not.
Yeah, right. But if I get these guys out, because I'm picking the guys out, we're going to get them out of the church. Now we can be
Pure.
We can be
holy.
pure and separated from sin. Why does Paul say? Now, I could get that out of what he's just said about getting the bad stuff out, that somehow we can kind of purify ourselves, right? Why does Paul say that is really impractical?
Because he goes on to clarify what he meant by...
Because you can't judge the other people.
Well, he could say that, but he doesn't. That's not what he says. That's not the direction he
He
goes.
says we can judge the Christians, but he
But
can't
not-
judge the outsiders.
Okay, and why is that important?
Well, they're still following the law.
You are living in a world where there are
all of this.
people who are greedy
Yeah.
and robbers and adulterers. The world around your church is the same world that's around every church, and you know it well because
You came from there.
that's your world, right? And you know what? Even though you may be different now, and you are, Paul's not going to say you are just like them. Paul's going to say, because you've changed, your attitude has changed, where are you living? You're living in that world. You're still living in that world. So don't talk about purity because
You'd have to leave the world.
you'd have to leave the world. That's right. You'd have to leave the world. Can you leave the world?
No.
Heck no. You know, you'd have to drink Kool-Aid,
Yep.
you know, or something. You know, that's the only way you're going to leave the world.
Jonestown.
Jonestown, that's right.
But
So-
you can't judge either, isn't it?
Well, he's he's going
You
to
can't judge.
well,
too?
he's going to move. He's got to move in there carefully, you know, because he sure has sounded like you're judging, right?
Well,
Because you're saying to this guy, you know, I'm turning you in, you know, to the police because you're breaking the law. You know, you're breaking the law here. I don't have a choice, you know.
Yeah, but that sounds harsh. I mean,
does
that's the
sound
point, but
harsh.
it sounds harsh from his other writings that that's
Yeah.
not really what he's doing.
Yeah, it sounds, and that's why he's going to have to explain, he's going to have to go back and explain why that's not what he's doing. That's what he's not saying, you know, that your relationship with God. In fact, to this point, he really hasn't talked about their relationship with God. He's talked about their relationship with one another and their relationship with the world. He hasn't talked a lot about the relationship with God. And that, I think, is pretty important. Look, in this church, if I find out that one of the youth leaders is, you know, attracted to young men, I'd have to turn her in, even though she's my wife. You know,
You'd have
I'd have to do it, right?
to, yeah.
Wouldn't have a choice. She'd be so mad. All right, she'd be so mad.
You better pick another example.
Yeah,
Good thing she doesn't listen to
she's
this.
gonna be so mad.
But isn't he in 12 getting around to the point about judging?
Yeah, he really is.
What
First he's going to say, okay, you live in this world. Even he lives in this world. What's his relationship with the world around him?
Trying to get through.
Well,
You
he's
know,
making the
it- it-
distinction, I'm sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, no.
He's making the distinction between the world
Mm-hmm.
and the brotherhood in Christ, because he says here, now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name brother.
Right. So the world is full of these folks doing these crazy things. That's just the way it is. Unfortunately, there are people in the church that are doing these crazy things. You know, not sinners, because we're all sinners, but they're doing hyper sin. They're doing crazy things. You know, they're doing crazy things.
Deeds of darkness.
Deeds of darkness, sure. Yeah, in this
Within the church.
within the church, within this world. You know, just like the guy that's living with his mother-in-law. Mother-in-law, that's even worse. You know, whoa, boy, I had vision. Stepmother, wow. Oh, mother-in-law. Oh, you know. Actually, I'd have to think about that. When my grandmother died, my grandfather brought a date to her funeral. And she
her
was,
funeral?
Oh yeah, my grandfather was interesting. If he had married her, she was younger than my father. In fact, she was about my age. So my father could have, lived with his mother, his stepmother, although people would have accused him of robbing the cradle. You know. So it was very complex. All right, so
Is that come
but
from being a Rudiger or being a Southerner?
it's a Rudiger.
Okay.
It's Rudiger, 100%. 100%. That's the blood flowing through my veins. All right, so the issue then is we got insiders, outsiders. What do I do with outsiders?
Evangelize them.
Yeah, evangelize them, but can't judge them because they're running around. I got no power over them. So the only power we have is
Inside.
inside. And you know, what's going to happen to the outsiders anyway?
They're eventually gonna be.
Well, who's the judge?
God.
God.
God is going to judge them. You know, God's the judge. Kill them all and let God sort it out. You know, God's going to be the judge. So it's not your job anyway to judge the world.
But he's going to judge the insiders.
He's
too.
going to judge the insiders too. But those are people you can help. You know, those are people you could say, stop doing this crazy stuff. No, you cannot contribute money to the church and funnel it to your daughter. No, you have got to get psychiatric help if you feel that lust after teenage girls. You need help. And you certainly should choose not to work with them.
Yeah.
Yes. Amen. All right. So if you're gonna have discipline, you exercise it where?
In the church.
Internally. By doing that, what's being created? What is he creating? When you say the outside is going to be judged by God.
Well, you're creating cooperation, you're putting people together.
Okay,
And
where?
accountability.
And with,
Where?
Inside the
Within-
church.
Inside.
within the church.
You're creating a new community, right?
Yeah.
A community of accountability, right? All right. So we've got Paul's writing first. We've got this problem that you've got to exercise. You've got to get this guy out. And even though you're arrogant because you're assuming authority that you don't have. You know, in reality, discipline only applies, you can only apply discipline within. You can't apply it outside. You know, it's kind of interesting, though, the number of societies, even Christian societies, that have attempted to take Christian discipline and do what with it? Apply it to society.
Even Calvin did, I read.
Oh, no. Calvin would never have done anything like that. Calvin did everything right. He didn't do that in Geneva. No, he didn't. He didn't outlaw dancing and theater and frivolous tunes. He didn't. He did. He really did.
It was fractured history, I read, huh?
Yeah, it was propaganda by those Lutherans.
Fake news.
Yeah, fake news. It's not true. All right. So we've got this situation going on now. If you've got this new community, right, where you got discipline, and discipline's exercised in this new community, what might undermine? Now, and you're not going to go out and judge. You're not going to take your standards and start judging and condemning people on the outside. That's up to God. What's one way that's going to undermine this community? That's happening, by the way, in the Corinthian church.
Well, other people come in.
Well, people are coming in to, okay, you got divisions, okay, more specific. What are the Corinthians doing? They've got this arrogant attitude that they have authority. Paul says, you know, to a certain extent, you do have authority. You do exercise discipline. That's
But
what
you're
supposed
not
to do.
using it correctly.
You're not using it correctly. You're also doing something that's undermining the discipline. You're doing the exact opposite of what you should be doing as a community. What the heck are the Corinthians doing? Go on. Keep on going into chapter 6.
Talking about when they're going to the courts?
They're going to the courts. You know, and the courts, remember, he just said you're surrounded by a world full of robbers and immoral people and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And inside, you got discipline, right? And you've been arrogant because you've claimed this authority and you think you're going to clean up the church. And what are you doing?
Going to civil
You're
court.
going to the courts. And what makes that even worse, that you're going to the courts?
That's the pagans.
You're going to pagans. Who are you taking to court?
The pagan, the
Other
person, well, the
Christians.
No,
person-
you're taking one another to court.
Yeah.
You were so arrogant to overlook this violation of moral law and civic law, and you're suing one another in court, which means who's going to be your judge? A pagan. A pagan is being a judge,
Yeah.
right? You're taking other believers. What have they completely forgotten?
The God-ordained way of handling disputes.
Yes. What did God say? What did Jesus talk about with his disciples? That they are going to sit in judgment seats, right? The saints are going to what?
Judge the angels even.
Judge everybody. And what are you doing? You're going to a guy who is a member of the Church of Aphrodite. Right?
Yep.
To cast judgment
On this guy, yeah,
with another Christian.
yeah.
You know, good night. This is awful. This is undermining the whole thing. All right, in fact, Paul gets kind of sarcastic with this. What does he say about the fact that you're taking your own people, your brothers and sisters, to court?
It's a
He's
shame.
talking about the confidence.
Man,
You judging other people.
It is a shame. You can't even find decent judges inside your community, people that can make this kind of judgment. In fact, what's the problem? What have the lawsuits already done?
Split things.
It's been a defeat to you. You're exactly right. It's part of this division thing.
Yeah.
It's part of this authority business. It's part of this division, that's going on. This kind of rivalry. It's a defeat. They have gone to the state to settle church-related issues. Does that have any resonance with us now? Lord, have mercy. Good night. The church is always doing that, right? What would be a good example of the church taking something that belongs to, of course this is my opinion, belongs to the church and letting the state make the final judgment?
Because God is the final judge.
Right.
So that is arrogance in itself, to entrust what is God's duty, if you will, to
Men.
men,
Right.
mere men.
Think about it.
And women.
And women.
And women.
What about marriage? Marriage. Marriage belongs to the church. Marriage belongs to the faith. And what have faithful people done? Said, whatever the state, however the state defines marriage, is marriage.
It's marriage, okay.
Baloney.
Yeah.
Baloney.
God defined it a long
God
time
defines
ago.
it. And it's a church issue. And I'm not even saying the church has to come to this conclusion. I'm not saying that. But it's a conclusion that's made by the church, not by the legislature in Charleston. That's giving to the state something that the state
belongs
shouldn't
to the church.
have. It belongs to the church. And when the church does that, when Christians do that, then they are doing exactly what Paul is talking about here. Instead of internal discipline, they're appealing to the state, to something that is supposed to be secular, to make judgment on something that should be sacred. And that's what's happening here. And that's what's happening with the lawsuits. You are trusting a secular judge to decide the fate of sacred people. And that's wrong. What does he say in verse 9?
I didn't get that far.
The unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God.
So again, going back to that same thing he said before, what is God doing to the people on the earth? God's judging them. Be aware that those who are wrong are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. So something, even in your church, if somebody does you wrong, you don't have to sue them, because eventually
God will take
they're going to have to face God.
And there's, as Jesus described, process.
Yeah, but the problem with that is you still have to live in this world.
Well, that's right. That's right. So we've got kind of a little issue here. Because he has said that Christians in this community, and I think you see little distinctions being made. Now, the cases that are being brought, what kind of cases are being brought to the courts? If it's one Christian against another.
It sounds like it might be money, because he says about being defrauded.
Okay, so if we're talking about issues dealing with money, what kind of issues are we looking at modern language? Civil. This is what's happening here. They're taking civil cases. They're using the courts to make civil determinations. We are not talking about criminal. Because the guy that's with his stepmother, is violating criminal law. That's where you turn him in and let turn him in.
Yeah, but you'd be violating God's law too there.
Right. So that's kind of clear. I think that, and when we look at Romans 13, we've got a lot about civil, you gotta obey the civil law. So we're not talking about criminal, we're talking about right here, these are civil cases. If in other words, if Bob and I have a dispute over fence, chickens, we're neighbors, and I have chickens, and the chickens are going into Bob's yard and eating your crops because you got crops. You're eating the crops. That's would be a civil case. What Paul is suggesting, if we are in the community, what should we do?
Put hands up.
What's that?
Share.
Well, what should we do? What do you think Paul would say?
Figure it out
Maybe
yourself.
share.
But
Figure
go
it
talk
out
to
yourself.
Within the community can help you figure that out.
You two need to talk.
We need to talk. We need Jeannie sitting there, and when I say, my chickens have a right to run around crazy, and Bob says, my corn has a right to grow, Jeannie says, well, Ed?
Yeah, but you can't,
What
that
do
doesn't
you-
work.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
Well-
And if it doesn't, Jesus said, take it to the church.
Right.
Well, but even if you take it to the church, I'm thinking that's how the Amish work.
Right.
And you're still taking it to an authority above.
Right.
You're taking it to a judge of the church.
No question. In fact, that's what Paul
So-
says.
So what's the difference between doing that and taking it to a judge in a civil court?
What's the difference?
In the church, one would hope that they're looking at God's word
Well,
for making the determination
then
and
you
applying
might
it
be
with godly wisdom.
Yeah, but then you might be looking at that church that his sister wanted to get married in.
Okay, is
So-
that a positive example? No,
No.
that's a negative example.
Yeah,
Then the church
but-
needs to deal with that.
But I don't think something like that God would even care about.
Well, I'm not
I think-
talking about.
Well, but you taking it to the church and having it judged in a church where whose chickens are eating whose corn, that would be a civil law. That
Right.
wouldn't be.
Well, it's not even a
Yeah,
civil law.
it's not even
Well,
that.
yeah, but I mean,
It
God would-
actually
No,
goes
they're
back
not talking
to
about whether God would.
love your
Yeah.
neighbor as yourself.
I agree with all that, but we're, humans, who's contributing more to the judge is sitting there judging is saying maybe in his head or her head, let's see, which one of these two guys, the chicken owner or the corn owner, who's contributing more to the welfare of the church financially? We don't want to lose that.
Well,
sure.
then you're making a judgment.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
yeah. Well,
And that happens.
well,
Yes.
but you're missing the point. He's not saying no. He's not saying okay, churches are bad, and there's this power structure in churches, and that's the way it is. Therefore, you've got to go to a secular judge that has no spiritual belief at all to make the judgment. That's not what he's suggesting. He's saying in the church that it should be. He's talking about the church as it should be. The church as it should be able to make these kind of decisions. You don't, as soon as you say, in this body, I am not going to get justice. I can only get justice by going to a pagan. Then the church community, what?
It's failing.
Is failing, is done. Then disband. If the judgment of that pagan judge is better than any judgment within this body, then this body has no meaning. It should dissolve, and we should be pagans, because clearly they've got something that we don't. And I think that's what Paul is suggesting. Now, I don't think Paul is looking at a modern church that is concerned about power structures and such. He'll deal plenty with churches dividing about power. He says churches shouldn't divide over power. If we are appealing to the outside for guidance, if I say whatever the state of West Virginia defines as marriage, then I'm saying the state of West Virginia has better spiritual guidance than I do, than the church does, right? That they are better arbiters of this faithful union than the church, right? I mean, isn't that what I'm saying? Well, I mean, you could say that's a good thing, but isn't that what I'm saying? Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
You're going by what they
Now,
say.
I may say, if I say, boy, that secular judge, he's fairer than anybody in the church, that's a pretty bad comment on the church.
Churches
I
doing what's
don't
supposed to be.
necessarily agree with that, but.
That it's a bad judgment on the church, or that,
I think it could be. I think that Paul was wrong here.
okay, well, that's okay.
I think Paul is being pretty arrogant here to think you're going to get human beings to act
But
that
you're
way.
trusting a secular judge, John.
And
But
he's
but
still,
as long as he's following the law, which you have lawyers
You mean the people in the church wouldn't follow the law, but he would?
could and could not.
Could, right.
But who
Well,
are you
we
going to
need to
have? Who are you going to have represent you in the church?
You may
You're going to be there representing yourself.
John, you have the right to your opinion.
I know
You
that.
certainly do. And
But-
what Paul is saying is, you undermine the unity of the church when you start appealing outside the church for
Okay.
judgment. That's what he says. That's what he
Why
says.
couldn't the farmer and the
Chicken owner.
chicken owner get together in the sense of, well, I'll give you a dozen eggs for what few kernels of corn are eaten by.
Well, I guess that was the kind of point I was getting at, but you could do it within the body. You
Right.
don't need to go to a secular judge to have him issue an order. But maybe you do. I think Paul would say if you have a good church, you shouldn't need to do that. If you have to do that within the body, then the body has problems. The body has problems. It
And they're-
needs to deal, they
and
need
they're
to deal
deeper
with.
problems.
They're
than
deeper
the
problems than
chickens and the
just
corn.
chicken and corn, yeah. If
Don't
that's
step
what you
on the
gotta do. But don't step on the duck. Okay, so.
I think a lot of people step
And,
on
and
that.
yeah, that, I've known that too. Okay.
Don't look at me when you say that.
You already stepped on the duck.
Now, and I'm gonna do this really, really fast, because we're gonna be done in 5 minutes. So we've got this, again, we've got this problem in this community, right? That's claimed authority over something there's no justification, this whole bad situation. And Paul is working all this. Well, there are areas where the church needs authority, needs to exercise discipline. There are areas where the church can exercise discipline. And there are some that the church needs to take discipline more seriously. Now, John, you said earlier, this undermines what he has said about law, right? About being free from the law. And if Pauline people following Paul, are the ones that are saying, this guy's free from the law, why are we condemning him? Paul's theology is being threatened, and Paul's not going to let that happen because he's a plotter. And so in verse 12, what does he say? He lays out a principle in verse 12 of chapter 6 that I think he hopes kind of explains how a church can take discipline over itself and yet still affirm that we are free from the law. What does he say in verse 12?
All things are lawful.
Do anything?
All things are lawful.
All things are lawful.
All things are lawful.
But not all things are helpful.
But not all things are helpful. Not all things are beneficial. And he even kind of explains what this beneficial business means. Everything is lawful, but certain things can do what?
Dominate you.
Can end up dominating me. And it doesn't mean, he's not saying that therefore it's against the law to do it, But you got to be aware of the stuff that can do what?
Harm you.
Can harm you, can dominate you.
Yeah, every law does not mean that it's good for you.
Right,
Because in every
Right.
law case,
right.
if there's a winner and a loser, the guy that loses thinks it's bad for him, the guy that wins thinks it was good for him.
Right.
I know, when I get those speeding tickets, it's not
Well-
a good thing too.
You know-
Especially the ones with cameras now. Be careful going up 7
Oh, I've been told.
between
Wellsville.
Toronto and Wellsville.
Well,
They
if-
got cameras.
If we go back to what this guy that's in the church that's causing a problem, how does this principle apply? For Paul, is it lawful in God's law for him to be living with his stepmother?
If all things are lawful, yeah.
Yes, that's lawful, but
Living with her.
but
But
is it beneficial? No. Is it beneficial to the church? Clearly not as beneficial to the church. Is it beneficial to him? Well, what
She's
by
paying the bill
what
with it.
what is yeah. Yeah, if she's a looker, if she has stepped on a duck, but is it beneficial? Because what's going to happen to him? What
He'll
is
be
He'll be caught eventually.
He's
It's a
breaking
criminal
civil,
act.
civil, he is a criminal. So it's not beneficial for him because he's a criminal. They're gonna execute him if they catch him. He's hiding out in the church.
And word
you know.
will get out.
Yeah, and it's not beneficial for the church, it's not beneficial for the community.
No.
But is it lawful? Well, yeah. It is lawful in the sight of God, but it sure isn't beneficial. It's lawful, but by this happening, what has occurred within that community?
Division.
You've got division, this issue, this attitude about authority that we have has ended up dominating this church. And they're applying it in
Wrong way.
really unhealthy ways. And he gives a little illustration about food. What's this business about food?
Oh,
Stomach.
food is for the
Food is for the stomach,
Yeah.
stomach's for food. What's the point of food's for the stomach, stomach's for the food?
Well, but God will bring both of them together.
Yeah, which means what?
It's
What-
transient. It's
Yes, it doesn't really matter.
It's not
It's
important.
not that important. What
Just
is
said the
important,
Jews.
though, yeah, what is important is, food is for the body, body's for food. What you eat doesn't matter, what you do. But what is important?
The body.
Because he's trying to explain what this beneficial means.
what is complete dedication to the Lord.
Well, and I think true, but I think it's even more practical than that. Food is for body, body's for food. No big deal, right?
Yes,
Not made for emergency.
But there are certain things
the body is not for.
that the body is not for, that ends up doing what?
Destroy.
Real damage to the body.
No damage.
There are things that you do. Are you free to do it? Sure. Are you free to eat pork rinds every day? Yeah, go to it. But you know something?
Should you?
They'll catch up to you sometime.
It's going to catch up to you. It's not beneficial. So what Paul is saying, there's some common sense involved here. Food is and stomachs are irrelevant, both are going to be gone. But there are certain things you can do to the body. And Paul picks out a couple, like fornication. And fornication, you got to understand, what it means now and what it meant then. It's different. It's different because fornication then was a whole collection of these sexual sins. I mean, it was a whole bunch of them. Fornication really does something. And why would he pick fornication and not something else?
Something everybody does.
Well, it's not only somebody does, but it's something that it's a physical. If he said stealing,
Well,
well,
my
Everybody has
version
to.
says, and make them members of a prostitute.
yeah, and that's another
Joining
example he
Christ-
gives.
Joining
Yeah.
Christ to a
Yeah.
prostitute.
That's something that he can, an illustration, if he's talking about food and stomach, physical stuff, there are certain physical things that can really mess you up. Joining yourself to a prostitute is one of them.
Well, and in Corinth, with all the temple prostitutes, they would have been very
Now they're
familiar.
museums.
Yeah, they were museums, that's right, because
Oh,
sailors would go.
I stand corrected.
Now,
They were
why,
museums.
why wouldn't
Rick's
that
not
be,
here, but-
why would that not be beneficial? I mean, why
Because
is
the
that
body is the
dominating?
temple of the
The body, he
Spirit.
said, the body is the temple of the Spirit. What does it, in very practical
It's
terms,
the Holy Spirit.
theologically, body is the temple of the Spirit, you are shoving the Spirit into these situations that the Spirit doesn't belong.
But in practical terms,
Yeah.
physically, today you're looking at the potential for, I think it's now 34 STDs.
What does it do?
Different ones,
what-
and which can, ruin your health
Sure.
for
What
life.
what does it do to the community? When they got members that are, spending Tuesday evening at the Aphrodite social.
Yeah.
What does it do to the community?
It could ruin a community if you're having a gay old time, or if you're having a good old time.
That would be another example, if they're having a gay old time.
Gay is in a happy
A
place.
happy place. If you're having, it undermines the community again. You have the same kind of situation as this guy here.
God ordained a family structure in society, and having the prostitutes and the immorality and all that undermines that basic societal structure.
And if that's going on, the people on the outside are saying,
They're no different than us,
That's right.
You know,
That's what they say.
yeah,
except they're hypocrites.
that's exactly right.
But I have a little problem from what I can remember about Romans and Paul, and this about Paul.
Adjusted my hat.
It doesn't
put
seem
gloves
like
on,
he's taken,
hooked on to his, and we
in
walked out the door
Corinthians,
like that.
taken into
And
consideration
only about 20 people
what
followed
happened in
us.
the Garden of Eden.
And, I mean, the whole church should have.
The civil
Really
part is
So,
been responsible for what's happened in the Garden of Eden.
so anyway,
I mean, you have that you're gonna have
He criticized
until
everybody
till the
because
coming of
they
Christ
said,
coming
"The only
back,
time you
yeah,
come to church is
according
Easter.
to
You
what's
don't come the
written.
rest of the
So
year."
you're always gonna have that contention.
He said, "What kind of preacher is this?"
And to me, it's like he's saying, cut yourself off from the civil
I
part
was
of
up
it
all night writing
when
sermons
you
for You
can't
take that kid out of here right now.
in the
And
world.
it was hot. There was
And
sweat.
in
Just
Romans,
sitting
from
in
what I
people's
can
It
remember,
just was one thing
it
after
didn't seem
the
like
other
he
that
went down
did,
that road
and
with
he kept
Romans.
saying-
Well, he
Really bad.
he may not have,
And I
because
had
that wasn't an
sung in
issue for the
choir
Romans.
years, and I had put up with
I
him
think
for at least
that
2 years
distinction
until I
between
finally
criminal
quit singing in
and
the
civil
choir.
is important.
Because I couldn't
I think what
take
he
it.
Well,
wants
let's just say
And
civil
then
and
Bobby
religious.
just looked at me
And
said,
the fact that you're
"You
talking
had
about
enough?" I said,
internal
"I've had enough."
versus, I don't know that
So
he
we
would
walked
tell
right
a
out of that
Christian,
church.
don't take a pagan to
And,
court.
Turned out he was an
Well,
alcoholic.
I can't even see not
So,
taking a fellow
I think
Christian
that
to
still
court.
didn't
I
help
mean,
the rest of the church.
I just
Why
can't,
didn't they,
because
like the pedophile, why
what
didn't they
happened
do
in the
something
Garden of
about him?
Eden-
Why didn't they get another?
I'm missing what happened in the Garden of
Well,
Eden.
when they
Well, he
A lot of
actually,
people.
he actually
ate
went
of
crazy.
the fruit of knowledge,
Uh-huh.
that changed things completely. That has
Stuff everywhere, it was terrible.
changed
But we left.
Right.
man completely.
Oh,
So you're always gonna have that civil part, even
That's
with
what
people within,
Yes, we were
Absolutely.
very
within the church.
absolutely. And
that can't be resolved within the church.
absolutely.
That kind of
No. Now, Paul would, I don't think Paul
Well,
would
that's
say
what I'm
that.
saying. I know you're saying that.
Yeah.
That's
I think Paul would disagree with that. I think Paul would say that.
That's what I'm confused, that's what I'm,
Well, I don't know, how would Garden of Eden mean you take it to a
Because-
secular
John was
person?
just-
which
A
I'm not
person
saying you
else.
wouldn't, but I'm saying
No, yeah, John was there.
because you're
No, he
human,
wasn't there. So
Right.
That was within the first 5
you have the
years,
same
50 years.
human attributes
So
as
this is
people
our first
outside the
adventure
church.
again.
Right?
Yeah. Oh,
That
yeah, I
everything
know
can't be
other people
resolved
who-
in the church when it comes
I know other
to
people who have been so
farmers' chicken
hurt
eating the
and
corn.
disillusioned by
Because they
the
may not
church.
be able to come to an agreement, and
Yes.
neither, they may
Well,
not judge it
See,
right.
See, I think Paul, I don't know that Paul will ever say, better to go to a worshiper of Zeus
But you can forget this.
to get your judgment about
I do not
this
want any part of
ethical
that,
issue
and
than to go to
over
a
time,
Christian.
Lord,
Better
so
to go
yes,
to a
you
father.
Okay, but we're not talking about ethical issues, that's what
Well, no,
maybe I'm
but that's what a
confused.
civil
It
issue
works.
is an ethical issue.
But,
Is an ethical
yeah.
disagreement.
And
Okay.
it gets
I think
back
that's what Paul
to
would say, that
the
if
But it
a
didn't seem
church
like
is a community.
Okay, but it didn't seem like it's what he said in Romans.
Oh, I think it is. I don't think it's, well, no, I don't know that it contradicts anything he said in Romans. And that's why he comes back later and says, we're really not talking about freedom from the law. We're talking about what is truly beneficial for you and for the community. That's
I
what we're
walked in the front
focusing
door one
on.
day
Because you
and
offer
said,
it.
"Oh,
I'm not going to
welcome our church. Is this
reinstitute
the
a
first time
law.
you've been here?"
Well, then if you're
And I've been looking
talking
at her
about
face for
what's
2 years.
beneficial to you and the community,
I didn't even
what
answer
is
her.
wrong with taking
Yeah, I
things
didn't- I
to the
didn't-
civil court?
If
That was
if
another one of the
I
things.
sue
It's
you,
just-
we're in this community, and I sue you, does that enhance the
Yeah.
unity of the church?
So,
But
And I
it's
mean,
not
you
a
know,
church
so that's
issue.
just-
Yeah, okay, I
Oh,
sue
yeah,
you
and
anyway. About
you're
the
not
chickens.
alone.
Does that enhance the
Unfortunately,
unity of the
there's
church? And I lose.
Many.
But-
Is that
who
gonna
have
enhance the unity of the
experienced-
church?
I mean, the stories
Well,
are
what
By a
different.
secular
but
judge.
What
What
if
if
you
you
lose
lose-
the same thing?
In the churches.
Oh.
what if
Okay, but at least it's inside the
Another thing,
community.
I didn't
We've
have a
worked it out of the
proposed
community. If I go to a secular judge and that secular
Well,
judge
one of my
rules
favorite
against me and I say,
stories, and I don't
Something
know
we
that
have to-
secular
if you're not
judge is
supposedly
Something
a-
we'll have to do on a side.
yeah, we're gonna have to talk about, because I don't, I see a big difference.
Well,
you
but
know.
I'm looking at the Amish community.
Everybody-
Well,
And that's a good example
Yeah.
to me
Yeah.
of what
And
he's
young
trying to
men
present.
Exactly. I think that's
came in
exactly what he's
and had
And
unkempt
I'm
hair
sure
and sandals
they got
and
disputes galore
torn
no, no
that
question.
but he
have
came
to
in
be
and
judged by
sat,
somebody, and
for
somebody's gonna be
worship.
happy and somebody's
And
No
not
when
gonna
que-
be happy.
and I don't think
pastor
Paul
said to him, "Oh,
And-
suggest anything,
here,
but if you're gonna do
but
it, it
next
should be a
week,
believer,
I'd like
not
if you would
a pagan.
wear more appropriate
A pagan's not gonna be
clothes
fairer
and
than a
be-
believer.
Well,
That's
why
what he's
couldn't a
looking for.
believer
When
be
you come
sitting
back.
on a judge?
And so.
Well, that's, that, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, I don't know.
Alright.
Okay, let's have a word of prayer and then
Go home.
go home. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us, remind us that it's not always real clear cut where we draw these lines. And as Paul is dealing with this community and trying to help them become what God has created them to be, that the lines that he draws are a little blurred. Help us to recognize that and help us to use something that often isn't used much in our society today, and that's a little bit of common sense. Help us to be able to apply that and get a better understanding of where we might want to draw the lines here. In the name of Christ we pray, amen.
And don't step on any ducks.
And don't